Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, join Joe and I as we interview Father Michael Rennier, the Vice Rector at the Oratory of Saints Gregory and Augustine in St. Louis, Missouri, and a recent presenter at the 43rd Annual Chesterton Conference. Stay tuned. This is Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. So happy to be joined as always by my co-host, Joe. How are you today, Joe?
Very well, thank you.
And as I said, we are wonderfully blessed to be joined by Father Michael Rennier. Hi, Father. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing great. How are you all?
We are good. For those of our listeners who are not familiar with you and your work, Father, would you give a little more of your background and what you're involved in?
Sure. So as you mentioned in the opening there, I'm the vice rector here in St. Louis of the Oratory of Saints Gregory and Augustine, which is an oratory set up for the purposes of offering the traditional Latin Mass. So on Sunday morning, you can find me here with about 1,000 homeschoolers. They all arrive, believe it or not, in about 20 giant vans. Right. I'm also a writer, so I contributed a chapter to the book on localism that you all just put together. It's a fine book. I've read it from cover to cover, and that's what brought me to the conference recently. I regularly contribute to Aletheia. I have a Sunday morning article with them. Typically, is where you'll find it. That's in the lifestyle section, which is nice because I get tired sometimes of writing and talking about theology. So sometimes it's good just to talk about how I'm a terrible parent and I'm not good at my job and right, these sorts of things. So part of my background is I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. Previously, I was an Anglican minister. So I am married and I do have 6 children. They all live at home and we have the time of our lives at home. I also am on the editorial board at Dabble Things magazine, where we publish original poetry and fiction. And that's a really great little magazine. If no one has read it, I'd encourage you to check out a copy of that. And then the last thing that I can shamelessly promote for myself here is my book with Sophia Press that came out. That's from about a year ago. It's called The Forgotten Language. It's on the poetics of the Mass, which sounds like a mouthful, but really it's nothing more than a meditation on how the beauty of the Holy Mass imparts a sort of a knowledge that's very winsome. And ultimately, it's the beauty of the Mass that converted me to the faith.
Very beautiful. Well, just to veer things in our direction just a little bit, that there's a lot there we could talk about for sure. But how has Chesterton kind of shaped your journey, particularly your conversion, anything, your writing, anything to do with any of that?
I remember reading Chesterton when I was still a Protestant. I think even before I was Anglican, because I was born as a Pentecostal, and I'm fairly sure it was Orthodoxy that I came across, and I read it, and I knew it was interesting, but I couldn't understand it at all. I was very confused by it, but there were little sentences here or there that stuck with me about the coherence of the faith and how, I think he uses that example of the person who's in the mental asylum, and they can really fixate on a certain point. And they can build a complete worldview around that point. And it's entirely detached from reality. And I remember thinking about that for a long time. And I was thinking, that's what my theological beliefs currently are, right? I thought that I had such a really coherent intellectual understanding of the scriptures and of theology. And I had it all together. And it made sense for a little bit. It calmed me down intellectually. I've always been prone to cynicism, even depression, and melancholy. And so over time, I would have all these existential questions about, well, who am I and what is my faith? And is this the right track for me? And for a long time, I could convince myself that this religious system I had built up was good. But Chesterton was partly helpful in getting me to understand, oh, simply because you delved into some scholarly treaty on a specific Greek word and Romans, and that you think that proves your whole system, that doesn't mean you're right.
Mm.
And there's something about the Catholic faith that she's there, and she has
Mm.
to be reckoned with.
Mm-hmm.
And the Catholic faith is not presenting a set of propositional, like intellectual truths that check all these boxes, then you can be a good Catholic. Certainly, we have our creeds and our beliefs and our abstract intellectual knowledge, but the church is so much more than that. She is an intimate and divine encounter. And when I began to see, oh, there's a much deeper knowledge here, or a much deeper intimacy with Christ that I'm being called to, that really rattled me. So, and Chesterton is to blame for that. So he started it. I didn't circle back around to Chesterton until much later, I think after my conversion.
Mm.
And I began reading, I think his autobiography was probably what I was reading most consistently. I think I've reread his autobiography 3 or 4 times now, and I'm kind of obsessed with it because he makes these really beautiful points about aesthetics. So he'll talk about, so he has the example of how his father, he says his father was this genius who would make all these random little things out in the back shed or whatever, and he was very insistent that his father was a hobbyist, and there's nothing more important in life than having a hobby,
Mm.
right? Because it's not just work, it's something you do because you love it.
Mm.
And one of the things his father made for him when he was a really young child was he made him that that drama set. It was like a stage of a play, and he had these little figures that he would play with on this play. And he remembers there's a guy with a golden key, and in that typical Chestertonian way that he has, he tells this really interesting story about the golden key and how fairy tales are true and life is beautiful, right? And then you forget about it and you read on, and he rambles for whatever 10 more chapters, and then at the end, this is at the very end of the autobiography, you realize this story was there for a reason.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Because that man on the golden key isn't just a thing that his father created, but the golden key, the beauty of it, is an analogy to something very, very real, very divine, very heavenly. It's Christ, right, holding the key to heaven, and he's the pontifex, right? It's the bridge between earth and heaven.
Mm.
And that's exactly what the kind of thing that really gets me going, is this discussion on how all of the beauty on earth is reflective of the beauty on heaven, or it's like going through this threshold
Mm.
into another life that somehow is still this life,
Mm.
but yet it's more, and it's
Mm.
more than we could ever imagine. And so they're the same, but they're different.
Mm.
Dante, I think, says it's like a sunrise within another sunrise. And Chesterton, in that really wonderful way he has of, he doesn't descend into abstract theology. I'm not smart enough to read that stuff anyway; it would bore me. But he tells it as a story. He says, "This is my life. This is how God encountered me and revealed Himself to me in a very personal way." But it's not just personal; it opens up into this divine reality, which at the very end of his autobiography he says, "It is the church." Right? And so once you know that, how could you keep yourself apart from the church?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, there's so much there that you mentioned, Father, that resonates with me. And one of the drums that I beat frequently in kind of speaking about Chesterton and sharing about Chesterton is this beginning via the way of aesthetics and the aesthetic appeal. As a matter of fact, I'm working right now on some work on Chesterton and Kierkegaard. I gave a talk a few years ago on Chesterton and Kierkegaard at a conference, and coincidentally, Dale Ahlquist's master thesis was on Chesterton and Kierkegaard. So there is something there, and I think that it is this. It's that, when Chesterton appeals, say, to the madman in orthodoxy, He doesn't. You can't make a moral, ethical appeal to the madman. He kind of just says, your life is stifled. You live in too small a space. Imagine how much broader would be your horizons if you didn't have this burden of imagining you're the King of England on your shoulders, for example. And in so many other ways, he talks about the symmetry, for example, of the virtuous life and the good life, and how things fit together, and it enables him to be a very generous apologist too, which is significant because he can see the share of beauty that is out there, say in the Protestant traditions, as he notes in Orthodoxy elsewhere, where he talks about the Protestant Reformation. He says that a cataclysm such as that, you will see the vices set loose and they wander and they do terrible harm, but the virtues are also set loose and they wander and do more terrible harm because they're divorced from one another. They're not working in tandem and congruity. And so I think, as you described your journey, it was just really resonating with that Chestertonian vision in my mind of and just what a wonderful witness he's able to be as an apologist to whether they're secularists or are separated brethren in other Christian communities, because of the fact that he can always sort of extend that branch that you have part of the truth here, but come further up, deeper in, come encounter the fullness of that truth that we have to offer. So.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think he jokes somewhere. He says, "All my life, I've just been trying to get people to complete their argument." Right?
Yeah.
He says, "You are correct, or you said this thing that sounds correct, but let's finish it off now and see what we are really saying here, or what we're really committing to."
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that sense of completeness, or that sense of Catholicity, that I think is so valuable in him.
Hmm.
Yeah. And it's cautionary tale too, because he sort of, I'm paraphrasing heavily here, but there's somewhere else where he speaks about how you could have a book loaded with facts that doesn't utter a single truth. And there, especially in our scientistic age, there's this tendency to think that facts are the things. The facticity of something, its truth value, and that in that rigid and I would say moribund sense is kind of something that can very easily lead us into poisonous ideology, because there's truth is something more vibrant and integral and living, and something to be encountered, and it's sometimes not through the way purely of the intellect, very often not. It's through the way of the heart. It's through the way that it just appeals to us, and this isn't an appeal to the emotions or to mere feelings. This is just I think the way that God has created us in his image, and that when he sees something, he's not seeing it as true in accordance with something outside himself, obviously, right? It's something that is in relation always. So anyway, we could go on and on, but I'd love to ask you, in a particular way. I know that in your contribution to the Localism book, and in your homeschooling of your own kids, or at least for a time, and then in this appreciation that you have for aesthetics, that this is sort of a important kind of thing that you take out of Chesterton and of the Catholic social teaching. Maybe speak into that broader importance of this sort of aesthetical appreciation for the full living of the Christian life.
Right. So for me, it's the radiance of truth. So that which is true will also radiate beauty and God's glory.
Hmm.
And we're not simply created by God our Father and put here on earth to know true things. All right. We're here to love true things.
Hmm.
And for that we need poetic knowledge. By which I don't necessarily mean you need to go out and read Shakespeare and become a Shakespeare scholar. It's not a bad place to start. But what I mean is we need knowledge of the beautiful in our own everyday lives. because this is all that a poem does. People are very intimidated by poetry and these sorts of things and say, I don't understand that stuff. And I say, all you need to do is like how it sounds, first of all. But second of all a good poem is doing is it's telling you a true thing that you had never thought of before. That's what it's doing. It's giving you an intimate truth. And it's always about a very simple, everyday thing. So it might be about a rose or an apple or seeing a leaf fall off a tree and being inspired and thinking through what does it mean to be here in this place, in this moment, and to be watching this leaf
Mm.
fall from the tree. Whereas I think Chesterton would say, why is it I'm so obsessed with horses? And I write these interminable poems about horses and that are, and he connects it to very specific experiences in his life. This is why I love a horse. I didn't just want to write an abstract poem about a horse as an intellectual exercise. I love horses. He's very clear about that. It's very simple. Right? A poet might say, I love beautiful flowers and I want to write about a beautiful flower, or the woman that I love, I want to write about her. And then that's what it's about. And we have to be very careful to not turn everything into an allegory for some abstract truth, because it's simply about this horse. And because the horse is valuable, and we should stand in gratitude and humility and wonder about the fact that I get to be alive today and I get to look at that horse running in the field. And then from there, we have this analogical process by which a greater concept opens up to us. This is a long way of saying that in our home and at Holy Mass as well, as a priest, it's very important to me that we're surrounded by beautiful things, because those beautiful things are leading us into an intimate knowledge of why we're here, which is to love God and to be happy. And if we're just going out and buying things at Walmart or following the latest trend or trying to make the Mass relevant or to make our home look like that magazine picture we saw because we're copying someone else and we're jealous that their house looks like that, then we're missing the point. Because the point is an invitation into creativity to make something beautiful in the way we worship so we can give God beauty, to make our homes beautiful because God wants us to live in beautiful homes that reflect our heavenly home. And this really is how we evangelize our families. This is the new evangelization. So for instance, in our parish, we go all out. I think I talked about this a little bit briefly in my talk at the conference. We go all out to give God our very best effort on Sunday morning. Beautiful things. We pour enormous resources into beautiful music and incense and vestments. And we want the experience to be transformative. We want the beauty to challenge you. It's not a lecture. We're not going to church on Sunday morning to be lectured to. We're there to encounter God through beauty. And what I see happening in our parish, especially with the young children, is that they have become obsessed with it. They love it. We have about 55, 60 altar boys who come in and argue and fight about who gets to do more jobs at Mass, and they challenge each other. They love it. They've recently started as a group chanting the daily office together before Mass because the boys want to do more. The girls have formed a schola, and the girls have been making processional banners. They've been hand painting these banners. The other night, for Our Lady of Snows, the girls had a procession, and they started throwing white flower petals all over as a reminder of snow inside the church, and then they chanted Vespers together. And the girls love it. It's the creativity and the beauty of it that is appealing to them. And I think that's why I called my book The Forgotten Language. I think that's perhaps overlooked, because we think if I can just argue someone or help them to see the intellectual truth of this, then they'll agree with me, which rarely happens, right? Especially in our modern era, where you can prove something's true to someone and they may even agree with you. And then they'll say, you've proved it's true, and that's your truth. But I'm going to hold on to my truth. I don't know what that means, but that will be the reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But bring them into something really beautiful, that's overwhelmingly beautiful, that challenges them, and they have a very different reaction. They might be confused. They might even be off-put for a little bit, but they are intrigued. And what we find is people come back, at least to our Mass. Um, in terms of the home, I find that this is how we educate our children. So along with their homeschooling and memorize the multiplication table and here are the facts, you need to know these things, we're also educating them in how to live a happy life, which is the goal of education, right? To be happy and hopefully to make saints. And in order to do that, you can't simply focus on math and science and STEM type questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to give them an entire education, which comes down to friendship and beauty and love.
I love that, and I love how you recognizing the beauty that's necessary in the church building. Totally agree with all of that, and then bringing that into the home, and it's really the echo of the domestic church there. I'm feeling from you a lot. So you have, what you need, you get what the church should look like in the church, and then you also sort of can have an ideal for the home that, like you said, doesn't consist of just copying, or it consists of bringing beauty and order to the home in a way, in sort of a similar way that you would to the church, right? It's the first place where you're going to educate your children and make them hopefully come to a deep love of what happens in the church building. So I love that. I love that connection that seems to be coming out of what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'll add to that it will be a little maybe controversial for some of our listeners, that I can think of no better definition of what would constitute full, active, and conscious participation than seeing a craft that seeing an example of craft that you perfected in the home. Let's say it's embroidery or sewing or lace making or flower arranging or whatever it is, and seeing it redound to the glory of God
Mm.
in the sanctuary, in the liturgy, rather than a functionalistic interpretation where if I'm not up there visible doing a reading or running around fulfilling this or that function, I think there's something lost there. And I love that, Grettelyn, you connect it to the domestic church, and there is in that sense a domestic liturgy kind of that I think, if the Eucharistic celebration is as we believe the source and summit of the Christian life, the more avenues of true connection, right, you form there. And let's face it, that's to me, that's a more robust connection than even, let's say, lecturing in the way that some will, lecture, because you're not doing that necessarily in the home. I mean, ideally, you should be, if you are a lector, especially an instituted lector, you should be praying and meditating and reading the scriptures as part of your formative life. But yeah, it's there's a, again, this sounds redundant to everything we've talked about, but it's so Chestertonian, right? There's a wholeness here. There's a whole truth of things, as Chesterton says, and there's always more ways to kind of enter into it and to see the way that it just fractally resonates out to all the different parts of our life. So I love that we can have that kind of meditation on the liturgy, which you're not going to hear in a lot of homilies nowadays. Yeah.
You'll hear
Yeah.
them in mine.
I would expect so. Yeah.
Yes.
They are so tired of hearing me talk on these topics.
but they don't know what they have. If that's true. Would love to hear more though about like your writing and how this seeps into your work. I've loved dappled things for a long time, and I especially love that the stories in there and the poems in there are all beautiful, even if they're treating on things that are ugly, objectively. And I think you sort of captured that a little bit in what you were saying earlier, but just if you could expound on that a little more, like how does because, it's a little bit obvious with some of the visual arts and even music, but I think writing can be a little more subtle. So like what does writing do for us that is different?
Sure. At its best, it shows us something true
Hmm.
and aspirational, which doesn't mean it's not difficult. It doesn't mean that it ignores that there are monsters in this world.
Hmm.
But what it's doing is it's arming us, and I'm just ripping off Chesterton, which I assume is appropriate here. It's not saying there's no dragons. It's saying you can fight the dragon.
Hmm.
You can be the hero that overcomes the dragon. You can rescue the princess.
Hmm.
And so it's showing us something very true, and reflective of who we are at the deepest level. So personally, when I write, it helps me to work out what I actually think.
Hmm.
So sometimes I don't understand what I think about something until I've put a lot of words on the paper, and
Hmm.
then I look at it and I think this is not at all what I had thought that I had this opinion on this topic. So before it was probably just an opinion, just
Yeah.
some knee jerk reaction. But once I write on something, especially if I have space to think deeply on it as I'm writing, I realized that my uninformed opinion was not particularly accurate, and it didn't reflect the truth or the beauty of that particular topic.
Hmm.
So what I think writing at its best does is it really pushes us to take a look in that mirror and to see how there's a divine reflection in it, because
Hmm.
so often we're afraid to do those things, right? So that's why we distract ourselves. We watch television and go to coffee shops and gossip, or whatever, because it's very, very difficult to just sit still for a minute in the presence of God, or even just in your own just with your own self, right? And just be with yourself.
Hmm.
Every year I go on my spiritual retreat, and I go for 5 days just entirely alone, and I go sit by a lake in the country, and I just sit there by myself and I read and I write, and
Hmm.
and by the end of it, I'm a existential mess, right? Because I don't know what to think anymore, but it's good for me, because otherwise throughout the course of the year I just think, oh, what do I need to do today? What's my checklist today? I need to
Hmm.
get this done and get that done, and it's a happy life, but it needs to be examined in order to remain that way.
Hmm.
And all of the arts do that, and writing in a particular way, because it's connected with the written word, or with the creative word himself, the second person of the Trinity. I find it, for me at least, particularly productive,
Hmm.
because what I'm doing when I write is I'm trying to name something that's almost unnameable. So it's this challenge. What kind of skill and craft or inspiration can I come up with, right? To try to hint or gesture towards this reality that really cannot be described.
Hmm.
And so that's really a lot of what Dabble Things is doing as well, which is why I always tell people, if you want to submit to us, we really don't want devotional material.
Hmm.
Not that that's not worth your time. If you want to write a devotional poem about how you love your patron saint, that's fantastic. It's just not what we're publishing. We're looking for those unflinching looks at reality,
Hmm.
and in the sense that it's coming out of a Catholic culture, we're really insistent that it has some sort of redemptive value, or that it's touching the transcendent in some way.
Hmm.
But beyond that, art does what it does, right? And it's creative, and so we want to see the creativity of Catholic artists, because when you are creative, you are working alongside with God, and it's one of the reasons we're put here on earth, to create beautiful things.
Hmm. Love that. I was talking a year ago, maybe, with Joseph Pierce about Evil and Wa versus the Brideshead Revisited versus The Great Gatsby, and how they're kind of, in some ways, similar stories, but one has the redemptive quality and the other one does not. Um, and it's amazing. I read them side by side just to see what would happen, and it is quite astounding, the difference of feeling and appreciation of beauty after reading Brideshead Revisited versus the absolute kind of destroyed, terrible feeling that you get after reading The Great Gatsby. Yeah, I do think it comes out of that Catholic culture that Wa was bringing to it, that
Yeah, people
Fitzgerald
misunderstand.
didn't.
You made a grievous mistake here by bringing up Brideshead Revisited, because this podcast is now going for another hour. So people mistake it and they think, oh, it's about this relationship between the Charles and Sebastian, and this is the Hollywood movie of it that's a complete
Sure.
tragedy and travesty that they made this. They completely misunderstood it. Or they just think it's about this family falling apart and how Evelyn Waugh loved 1920s Oxford, and it's an elegy for that. But of course, when he was asked, what's the book about? He just simply said it's about Catholicism. Right? That's what the book is about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tragedy, yes. But in the end, the light of the tabernacle is burning. And so whatever part we play in this story, whether it's a comic part or a tragic part or a heroic part, or we play the coward, the prodigal son who has to repent, or the elder brother who takes a long time to get it, whatever part you play, it's part of this story that God is writing. And in the end, his presence is victorious. And I think it's so genius. And that's why I love Brideshead Revisited. In fact, I think I preached a homily about it about a month ago.
Well, it's not a tragedy for the souls of the characters, right? That's kind of the amazing
Right.
thing about it. It is a tragedy on a material level, but not for their souls. Anyway,
Right.
that's another topic. Sorry, Joe's saying, back to Chesterton.
Well, I'll make my own shameless plug that I did do a talk on Chesterton and Waugh at the conference back when it was in Slippery Rock several years ago. So last time it was in Pennsylvania, in fact. So maybe folks can go. I think it's on YouTube. You can find that. But yeah, similar observations that it's all about what Charles finds when he goes back into that chapel at the end of all of this. In spite of Cordelia's prediction that it would be Good Friday forever, it's not. So, well, Father, I would like to kind of pivot as we get towards the end here. I'd like to hear maybe advice for how do we kind of practice this? Because let's face it, we talked a lot about what flourishes and comes up out of Catholic culture. And certainly we here in the Chesterton Society and in the Chesterton Schools Network are doing our part to try to rebuild and restore and develop a Catholic culture that naturally or at least facilitates giving rise to some of these virtues and some of these habits and practices. But for a lot of folks, they're going to find it difficult. So what just sort of as a pastor, what pastoral advice would you have for people who, wherever they are in their own life, to try to embrace this kind of way of thinking, of finding the beauty in things, of making beauty, and of letting that all be part of their prayer and their approach to worship?
I always start by assuring people that they deserve it. They deserve beauty. They deserve to live
Well said.
beautiful lives, because we're so brainwashed into thinking that we're consumers and we're just surviving and be productive or you're not important. And so people become fixated on that, or they get ground down against their own will by this corrupt system we're in, to put it dramatically, that they're looking for space to simply be happy. And they're struggling to find it, or think they're unworthy of it, or think it's not for them. And what I assure people of over and over again is that God wants you to be happy. And to become a saint is to become uniquely yourself. And so we're not going to make much spiritual progress if we're copying other people or trying to follow some systematic program for spiritual development 101 or what have you. We become happy by responding precisely to the gifts that God has placed within us and allowing Him to love us and returning that love. And no one else can do that for you. But the good news is you get to do it, right? You have permission, right? Go be happy. We do not have to be sorrowful, dour, puritanical people. You can make your home beautiful. You can affirm poetic beauty in your home. And it doesn't mean you're a bad Catholic. simply because, say, St. Francis didn't do the same thing and he got rid of all his stuff. Or your friend down the block fasts 8 days a week, and here you are, eating on Friday or something. You live your own spirituality as God convicts you, right? And as he encourages you and gives you the grace to do that. And it doesn't have to look like what the world insists it looks like. So you can live in whatever kind of house you want and make it beautiful the way you want and have as big a family as you want. And no one else gets to say anything to you, right, about whether that's appropriate or acceptable. And if they do, they don't know what they're talking about, right? So this is my constant drumbeat. The world doesn't act on you. You act on the world. You're in this beautiful story that God is writing. And you are the main character. We're all main characters. He died for each and every single one of us. So allow him to love you and love him back. And almost by definition, you will look back on your life and think that was a beautiful 100 years that I was given. And I'm grateful for it.
Thank you, Father. That's beautiful. I think sometimes we all need that freedom to have somebody say to us, this is how it should be. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great talk. We'll have to have you on again sometime just to talk about WA or something.
Okay.
We'll take a deep dive. And anyway, thank you so much as well, Joe. Always great to chat with you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening and watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button. We're in the world, not of the world, but we do have to play the game. So help YouTube understand that this video should be shared with other people. Because as we know, Chesterton is always, always better with friends. Thank you and God bless.